During this webinar, we will be discussing not just the recent papal encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, but also the larger issues that AI is calling everyone to think about when it comes to Christianity and public life. I'm Alex Arnold, the facilitator for today's webinar and the Director of Research at CCPL. In a moment, I will have our distinguished discussants introduce themselves, but before we get to that, I wanted to say a little bit more about CCPL for those of you who are not familiar with our organization. CCPL's mission is to contend for the credibility of Christian resources in public life for the good of the public. Our vision is for a healthier politics and public life which benefit from positive Christian contributions. And we work toward these ends in two streams. First is our Christian civic formation stream. This involves working with current and aspiring civic leaders to help them develop their inner lives, to help form themselves professionally and spiritually, to bring a most precious Christian resource to public life, namely themselves. Second is our work in public imagination, where we help to shape the public's knowledge and imagination regarding Christianity and its relationship to public life. This webinar is one part of this larger endeavor. If you want to learn more about CCPL, engage with some of the content we are putting out, or otherwise get involved in our work, let me invite you to sign up to get our newsletter. That's the QR code on the left of your screen. Consider joining our national call to silence and solitude. That's the center QR code on your screen. And encourage you to subscribe to our Substack. Everyone has a Substack nowadays. Ours is the heart of the public, where we publish what I hope are thoughtful essays twice weekly on topics at the intersection of Christianity and public life. I should say we are approaching 1,000 subscribers and would love perhaps one of you to push us over that milestone. We are so grateful that you have decided to take an hour out of what is no doubt a very busy day to listen to our distinguished panelists and me discuss Magnifica Humanitas, AI, public life, and Christian faith. So one last housekeeping point. Those of you viewing this webinar are encouraged to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A function, which is not the chat function. So we will be monitoring the Q&A during our panel discussion, but we'll hold off from turning to audience questions until about the last 15 minutes or so of our time together. So with that, I would now like to invite each of our discussants to introduce themselves briefly, share a bit of their background, and explain how their interests intersect with this webinar's topic. And we'll start with Professor Elisabeth Kincaid.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks for the invitation to be here on this webinar. I'm excited about this discussion and learning from the other panelists. I am a professor at Baylor University in Waco. I am the Associate Professor of Ethics, Faith, and Culture at Truett Seminary. I'm the Director of the Institute for Faith and Learning and an affiliate professor at the Hankamer School of Business. So professional, kind of from a research side, I'm very interested in this topic and in the overall encyclical tradition. I came into the academy kind of late. I was an attorney, a finance professional, and a campus minister. And so a lot of my research and teaching relates to the question about how Christian theology informs law, informs business, and informs church leadership. So I will say I'm very grateful for CCPL and have been a long time subscriber to the newsletter because of the way it intersects with my research. So a plug for subscribing to y'all, what y'all put out. So obviously a lot of these questions about AI impact deeply how we think about the law, how we think about business, and how we think about leadership in the church. So I'm interested in it on the research side. As an administrator at Baylor, the director of the Institute for Faith and Learning, I'm involved in a lot of discussions across our campus related to how, as a Christian research university, we are thinking about the right way to use AI, how it impacts our students' formation. We feel as a Christian university, we have a heavy obligation for student formation and how it impacts our future research and teaching. So I'm engaging with this both as an academic researcher and as a university administrator.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Let's go to Brandon next.
Yeah, so I am a philosopher. I've got doctoral training also in neuroscience. Former associate professor. I've taken a break from the academy to spend my time working on philosophy of technology, AI, and spiritual formation in the context of public life. And so my research interests have been in the philosophy of technology for the past 12 years, in the philosophy of AI and in the philosophy of consciousness in particular, and how those all coalesce into theories of spiritual formation. So I just kind of think of all philosophical topics grounding out in the nature of persons and the nature of consciousness in particular. So this is really right at the heart of all my major concerns. I've been talking about this for about 12 years or so, and I'm glad to see a lot of work starting to come out, although there's not many Protestants, so we need more Protestants to be working on these issues. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and yeah, just very happy to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Brandon. Always enjoy a call for sturdy Protestant backbone. Although CCPL, not sectarian. So mere Christianity for us. Let's go to Peter next.
Yeah, Alex, thanks a lot for the invite. I'm excited to participate today and learn from our panel here. I am a lay Anglican in Pittsburgh, Anglican Church of North America. Um, I live here with my wife and three young children. And I am a career software engineer, so I have a educational background in computer science and information technology. I currently work in um, biomedical applications for software. And in the past, I've worked in several other applications, the materials science domain. Um, our industry obviously created um, artificial intelligence, and we're also at the vanguard of seeing it applied in our profession. So this is something that I think about on a practical level day to day. It's been great to take an opportunity to take a step back and look at the philosophical and theological implications of this technology. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you to all of you. So I'd love to have Elizabeth, I'd love to have you kind of lead us off by providing us with a 30,000-foot overview of what's kind of the kind of conceptual and ethical core of Magnifica Humanitas, which is Catholic social teaching. It plays a very important role in the argument of the encyclical and the way the encyclical analyzes various aspects of emerging technology. So I'd love to have you just kind of give us an overview of what Catholic social teaching is and how it kind of plays out in the encyclical.
Sure. And this is a topic I love. So Catholic social teaching, I have found, is very unique in the Christian tradition in that it is a sustained reflection upon kind of pressing contemporary issues across time that's very self-referential. So for people who are reading the encyclical going, why are there all these footnotes? That's why. It is a continuing dialogue that the popes have been having with each other since the first sort of encyclical marking the beginning of Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, which was released May 15th, 1891, hence why Magnificat Humanitas was released on May 15th on the 135th anniversary of the encyclical. So Leo the 13th, not our current Leo, the Leo of Rerum Novarum, was facing a really unique moment for the Catholic Church in Europe in 1891. Up until that point, from about arguably the 400s to a little bit before his papacy began, the Catholic Church had been not only a spiritual governing body, but also a temporal governing body. And due to the the formation of the Italian nation state, they had lost all of their lands except Vatican City, which is why Vatican City remains a separate nation state still to this day. You can go and send a little postcard from there and get a Vatican City postmark. And this caused him and other church leaders to really say, well, how can the church speak to the modern world? We're not a nation anymore. And Leo really led the way in leaning in to the church's emphasizing the Pope's role as a spiritual leader, that the Pope was able to speak, not being a sovereign anymore, could speak across national divides and address contemporary issues of the day. So Rerum Novarum was very groundbreaking in that for the first time it was a papal document, sorry, not the first time, but kind of in a coherent large scale sense, engaging with questions of economics, of politics, of laborers' rights, questions about the family, questions about education in a theological way, but aimed at addressing the challenges, the contemporary challenges people were facing. And since 1891, every pope has continued this theory, this sort of practice of theological reflection, looking at the challenges of the day. So you will see in say the 1950s after World War II, an engagement with questions of nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation. You'll see in the 1930s engagements with questions tied to the Great Depression. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be very familiar with Pope John Paul II. He, writing in the 80s, is engaging with questions about the Cold War. How should we think about communism? How should we think about capitalism? Pope Francis brought the tradition into engagement with questions about the environment, saying how we interact with nature and questions of environmental degradation are impacting us to this day. And obviously, Leo is continuing the tradition of asking questions about how we should engage with this new technology of AI. So when you read the document, you'll see probably the first third is Leo XIV's restatement of the key principles of Catholic social thought. These include human dignity, emphasis on social justice, solidarity, which means connection with other people in the created order, subsidiarity, which means sort of proper levels of power, and questions about war and peace. So he's sort of summarizing, restating the key principles of the tradition, and then inviting Catholics, other Christians, and all people of goodwill to take these principles and use them as analytical tools in light of the gospel for the questions and challenges of our own age, our own cultural context.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So you mentioned one of the core principles of Catholic social teaching being the teaching about human dignity. And that seems to be a real major issue that's coming up a lot in discussions about AI. And what it does is it kind of forces us to think carefully about what I, as a philosopher, would call metaphysical questions about AI. What is this thing at some fundamental level? And so I think it would actually be real nice to uh, have some discussion about some of the technical aspects of like what are LLMs, but also maybe some of the philosophical aspects. So, Peter, I'd love to have you just kind of give, again, a 30,000-foot overview of sort of the technical underpinnings of LLMs, what these things are, how they function.
Yeah, absolutely. With the caveat that I am, I guess, maybe a classical software engineer, and I work with deterministic systems. I'll do my best to try to give a quick overview of how this technology works. So fundamentally, the way that and I'll be limiting my comments to large language models, which are the underpinning of the chatbots that we're usually talking about when we talk about AI. The encyclical maybe rightly leaves this as a pretty nebulous and all-encompassing concept, which AI has been throughout the the history of computer science. People like to say that technologies are referred to as artificial intelligence until they are well understood and adopted by the industry, and then we call them software instead, and we move on to the next definition of AI. So I'll talk about large language models. Words within these systems are represented as vectors, and a vector is just in this case a very large list of numbers. Everybody is familiar with vectors when they learn about how to read a map. When you talk about latitude and longitude on a map, that is a 2-number vector, right? You're, at least where I live, the latitude tells you, the further north you go, the lower your latitude number is, and the further west you go, the lower your longitude number is. So words within these systems are represented as vectors. Instead of 2 numbers, we're talking about thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands. Lately, these numbers have been much more opaque, but they used to be quite open. And GPT-3, for example, was 12,000 numbers per vector. So all of that, what that means is that all of these words are located in a vector space near each other. It's not a vector space we can conceptualize of, but they have locality and proximity to each other across these many dimensions. It's also worth noting that words can be represented in multiple ways within this vector space. So for instance, a homonym, the word bank, can refer to either, the land next to a body of water, or it can refer to a financial institution. The vectors within this vector space, that list of numbers for those 2 words would bear very little resemblance to each other because they have very different meanings. Human beings can determine those meanings through use of context, but for the computer, you need as long a list of numbers as you can get to disambiguate what you mean. When these models are trained, they are trained by reading enormous amounts of text, essentially all of the text that human civilization has ever created, right? And they're trained initially through completion. So you're given a text, you hand a text to the system, and you just say, predict the next word. What is the next word that should come after this block of text that I've given you? And initially, the model will be wildly wrong. All of these vectors are initially just completely random values. And so at the end of, when you get output back, you tell the model, no, it wasn't supposed to be that word. It was supposed to be some other word. And that feedback goes into the system. It tweaks some of these hidden values within the system, and it gets progressively, slowly, bit by bit, better at giving you the next word in the system. There was an important step change in the development of this technology that goes by the name of attention or transformer architecture. And this allows words to be updated with information given their context. So instead of simply taking a linear list of words and trying to predict what the next word should be, we're instead looking at a much broader chunk of the text and the context. So that example of the bank that I gave it earlier is a good example. Will change those the numbers in that vector to more closely represent numbers that are closer to the financial institution area on the map, if you will, rather than the geographical area on the map, if that makes sense. And then attention is followed by feed forward mechanism when we're doing prediction of this next word. Um, so, and this is where these models are opaque even to the people who create them. You are running you're running these vectors through a set of transformations, simple arithmetic, that allows you to better perform the prediction that you're talking about. And again, you can do this on the map as a human being. You take a two number vector. If I subtract from my latitude, I'm going to move north. If I subtract from my longitude, I'm going to move west. So if I subtract from both, I'm in Pittsburgh, maybe I end up in Cleveland, right? And so we could say you can do the same operations on these word vectors. So researchers have seen that if you ask the model to complete the capital of France is Paris, therefore the capital of Poland is, and ask for the next word, it will apply a mathematical operation on that vector that corresponds to the concept of a capital city. So you're doing a mathematical operation that moves from Poland to Warsaw, right? So I can get into a couple of other topics that make these actually much more practical in their application. Reinforcement learning is one, and chain of thought reasoning is another. But I feel like we've already delved quite a bit into this topic. I want to leave some room to breathe here.
Great. So, the encyclical really takes what struck some readers and some critics as a very strong stance about what AI isn't or what it's not capable of. So, reading from paragraph 99 of the encyclical, His Holiness says, so-called artificial intelligences do not undergo experiences, do not possess a body, do not feel joy or pain, do not mature through relationships, and do not know from within what love, work, friendship, or responsibility mean, nor do they have moral conscience, since they do not judge good and evil, grasp the ultimate meaning of situations, or bear responsibility for consequences. They may imitate language, behavior, and analytical skills, or even simulate empathy and understanding, but they do not understand what they produce, for they lack the affective, relational, and spiritual perspective through which human beings grow in wisdom. And for those who watched the live sort of drop of the encyclical, you will know that one of the co-founders of Anthropic, which is the frontier AI lab responsible for developing the Claude chatbot, his name is Chris Olah. He was there, and he kind of pushed back on the Pope's claims here in the encyclical. And I'm just sort of curious, Brandon, you're a seasoned thinker on issues in philosophy of mind. I'd love to give your take on this kind of debate between people in Anthropic, Chris Olah in particular, who are more open to the possibility that, like Claude in particular, is coming to be like a person, coming to actually think and have feelings, or states that are functionally like feelings, versus someone like the Pope, who seems to be deeply skeptical that at least AI as we have it now, LLMs as we have them now, are anything approaching something like a person or a conscious thinking being.
Right. I talk about this a lot, and so the topic gets technical really, really quick, and people are quick to dismiss it as something that's not applicable to ethics. But if you care about the mental health implications of large language models, then you'll be forced by the empirical research to think that you have to address the issue of consciousness, because the primary indicator for people forming maladaptive and unhealthy relationships with artificial assistants is not loneliness. Actually, I thought that was going to be it. It's the second, but the primary indicator is that they attribute consciousness to the large language model. That is the primary indicator for an individual to start forming an unhealthy attachment to a large language model. And there's all sorts of interesting reasons behind how they work and why that's the case. But I want to say our understanding of consciousness is really, really important on this topic. And for some background too, I want to say it frustrates me to think that that the encyclical is being talked about as something that's on AI, because there's very, very little that has to do with AI. And there has very little, and anything it does say largely isn't even about AI. It's about what we believe about ourselves in virtue of our interaction with AI. And those two things are really important to come apart. Because another way you could think about it is, the issue about consciousness, very technical, it's hard to get at, right? I think it's even steps beyond, say, quantum physics, and that's scary to study. But we can talk about the impact of us thinking that they're conscious or attributing it to conscious. So on the view that I've held and written on, I don't think that any kind of machine could, in principle, ever become conscious. I think there are in principle arguments to think that's just that what we're doing with AI is not even of the same kind of thing that consciousness is. But we could talk about how it is that we attribute consciousness. And so, insofar as I understand the encyclical, it's primarily saying that um, our biggest problem here is not whether or not machines will become conscious or like us, but that in virtue of our interaction with them, we'll start to think of ourselves as more machine-like. And I think that there's a strong case to be made for that. And if you're interested, I've been writing and talking about this for a long time, and there's lots of stories to be told here. One of the things that crosses over to here is that um, everybody knows what consciousness is in terms of their experience of the world. Like no one has to be told that having their heart broken is different than being burned on a stove, right? Everyone knows that those have very, very different feelings to them. And so, in an experiential sense, people know what consciousness is. Now, when you get to the level of starting to work on the areas of consciousness, that gets very, very strange really, really quick, primarily because the modern paradigm, although this is changing, but the modern paradigm has been one that's depersonalized and mechanistic. And what's interesting is that the encyclical mentions this kind of this idea that we aren't machines in certain ways, but then it concedes this point by talking about these sorts of digital minds or digital thinkers or things like that to actually be functionally better than we are, right? Now, that's just bizarre to me because the difference between me tripping and me walking have to do with my mental states with respect to like what I'm trying to do with my body. My intention to walk across the room is very different than my falling across the room because of the way my mind is, the way how I'm acting in virtue of my reasons. And so functioning in a particular way is very, very different than acting for a particular way. That is to say, you can function as if you're thinking, but not be thinking at all. And so to make the comparison that they can think as well as we do is just bizarre in a category error, I would think. What we get from the encyclical, again, is not any explanation or statement about what AI is. We don't get a statement about what consciousness is, experiences are, thought is, or anything like that. And I want to say that that's really, really unfortunate, but I also understand too that this was not written to academics for that purpose. But another way you could think about this would be uh, the question could be, well, what is the sort of thing that we could think of as being conscious? So, from my perspective, from everybody's perspective, at least when you're thinking about yourself, I'm a conscious being. I experience myself that way. Whatever I am, I'm a conscious being. And you could think then about, what a large language model is. And it's not clear on the metaphysics as to what it is. Is it actually the hardware that it's running on? Right? Is it the token instance of the particular program indexed at a particular time? What part of it is it? Peter pointed out is we don't understand what part of the neural networks are doing anything that's relevant to the output that we get. So specifying it as a neural network being the thing that is thinking is a misnomer and inaccurate. And our claims about that are likely false. So even being able to talk about and specify what it means for a computer to be thinking, we've got it. We don't have a clear picture of that if we're going to just talk about the bits of physical parts. So the last point I'll sort of make about this is if you get together a group of neuroscientists and ask them what consciousness is, you'll get like 10 to 12 different definitions of it. Uh, and not only that, then if you've got disparaging views on definitions, you're going to have large scale disagreement on how it is that you could discover whether or not something was conscious. And if you can't solve those sorts of issues, then you certainly couldn't solve the issues with AI. If you think the way about going about working on consciousness is this reductive physicalist, taking everything about the experiences and putting them into external relations among bits. If you think that's the way to get at it, then we don't even know how to really ask that question yet. If you think that consciousness is the sort of thing that we experience and is irreducibly personal, and the encyclical does have a lot to say about personalism, I think. Well, then the discussion is something different, and then I think there it's fairly easy to argue that they're not and couldn't be.
So at the very least, Brandon, what you would do is you would counsel skepticism about the claims of people that think LLMs, as we currently know them, and perhaps any future iterations of AI, might be conscious or persons or really thinking in any sort of way. I wanted to pull on this thread that you raised about the encyclical's main worry, not so much being these sort of metaphysical issues about AI, but actually about the way in which AI, the way in which we interact with AI, how that might affect us for good or for ill. And so the way you put it is that as we engage with AI more and more, we run the risk of thinking of ourselves as more machine-like than we in fact
Mhm.
are. So I'm wondering if there is a particular place in the encyclical where you felt like this was sort of really sharply put. Maybe you have in mind like paragraph 92, where the Pope introduces this idea of the technocratic paradigm. But I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit more on this issue.
So I'm thinking of 172, and that's the where I find what it seems to me anyway, the only explicit place in the encyclical that says what is going on and why. So it just starts off with just at the root. So when someone says, well, it's at the root, I'm going to listen. So it says, at the root of these problems lies a theocratic and post-humanistic mentality that tends to regard human persons as an object to be manipulated or a resource to be optimized. And if you studied philosophy of technology, you'll see in the encyclical, you've got Heidegger here, you've got Jacques Ellul, you've got Bormann, Weiner, Feynman, Illich, all over the place. And one of the things that's happening here, I think, is that it's telling us that the fundamental problem here is that our use of machines, and this is an old problem, it's not specific to AI, but our use of machines in particular ways is not morally neutral. It's not epistemically neutral or socially neutral. Any sort of technology comes into the world with a kind of moral presence, a formative presence is how I'd rather put it. And the ways that you use your technology is going to change how you think about yourself and other people in terms of other types of technologies. And so the way that I think there's some Heidegger here is that the way that you think about nature is going to be inframed by the way that you think about technology. So Heidegger's example is when we start using a mill, right, an old sawmill next to a river, that changed the way that we started thinking about rivers. And we started thinking of them in terms of their potential to bring about the kind of change that we want. And we turn them into these causal mechanisms, primarily waiting for us to turn them into something else. And Heidegger and Ellul and others are saying that's exactly what's happened with the human person. And the more that we get in terms of talking about our technologies as being persons, having agency, being intelligent, the lower our view of what counts as intelligence or agency will value, that lowers too, and then we start to treat ourselves more like machines and less like people. That's the sort of general thought
Yeah.
there.
I I would I really think that concept is vital to understanding how we're being formed by this technology. Um, there's a famous case study in the design of systems. which was an, an air disaster, an Air France flight that was attributable to the pilot's over-reliance on autopilot. So this is a really early example of a software system um, substituting for human judgment. Um, uh, Passenger aircraft in particular were very early to adopt technology. This is obviously pre-LLM, but a type of technology that substitutes for intelligence. And the root cause analysis of that disaster concluded that the young pilots who were in charge of this flight at the time that it plunged into the Atlantic Ocean had simply not had enough time in the saddle um, to understand what was going on with their aircraft. So they had logged many, many flight hours in the aircraft that they were in, but those flight hours had functionally been performed not by them, but by the computer systems on the plane. And so they were incapable when the system gave up. In software, we call this an edge case. They had a sensor failure. The system said, I don't know what's going on. The plane is not behaving the way that I would expect. Over to you guys, right? And they just had no capability to take over in that situation. You're going to end up in this situation if you allow the cognitive offloading of your day-to-day work to a computer system like this, no matter how it's created. And this broadens out even further than just information technology specifically. You mentioned Ivan Illich, and I think we can bring subsidiarity into this discussion. Illich proposes this model of society where technologies should be designed to work with human faculties, right? To allow us to use our own faculties to achieve greater things than we could on our own, not to substitute for faculties that we should be exercising as they are God-given, right? So I think this is a discussion that's been had in my industry for as long as information technology has existed. Steve Jobs loved to talk about the bicycle for the mind instead of getting in your car and sitting and allowing the car to do all the work. Instead, your software should be designed to allow you to use your faculties. The bicycle is a great analogy to move further than you otherwise could. So on a bicycle, you're still moving your legs, but you're moving a lot faster than if you were walking. So I think those visions have always been present in our industry and in the church. And I think when the encyclical talks about subsidiarity, we get closest to sort of addressing these questions about how our technology is forming us and what pitfalls we could run into regarding that.
I think to build on that, Leo is deeply concerned not just about how we are being formed and kind of our cognitive capacities, but how technology changes the way that we see other people, how it affects our engagement with the other. And I think in that same paragraph that you just referenced, he comes back to this concern that the inequitable distribution of technology and kind of technological ability can not only sort of through economic modes create kind of secondary citizens, but can make people like all of us who live in a leading technology country very easy to view the people who don't have access to that technology as less than a second class, as machines that it's fine for us to use to achieve our own ends, very much against the virtue of solidarity and the Catholic thought of the preferential option for the poor, that we should be thinking about, in line with Jesus's commands, be thinking about the poor first. And technology makes it very easy to not think about the poor at all, or not think about them as people like us. So there's kind of a a possibility just as technology gives us distance for this corruption to occur, kind of a moral corruption to occur.
So, I mean, we've been talking about this formational issue. I'm just wondering, so one way to react to this conversation is to basically set as a policy for oneself, you know what, I ain't going to use AI. No way, no how, never. Now, what's interesting is the encyclical does not take that route. It doesn't sort of declare a ban on the use of AI or encourage people to not use it. So I'm wondering, what kind of practical thoughts or advice do you have about people's engagement with AI, especially if they're in a workplace where they don't necessarily have a whole lot of slack in terms of whether they use it or not? I mean, there's also the very real thing, the very real phenomenon we started to see where, so Elisabeth, you're in higher ed, students are using AI. They're using it probably in vicious ways. Maybe a few of them are using it in virtuous ways. I'm just curious. I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on like, if we're not just, I mean, one option is to just say, don't use it, stay away from it. But I'm curious what your perspectives are on, well, if you are going to use it, what are the good ways to use it, and how can we guard ourselves from being malformed by our engagements with AI? So maybe Brandon, I'll start with you.
Hmm. So I would, I get, yeah, this is the really important question. I think the first thing I want to say is we need to stop talking about AI. And by that I mean like the word AI, and Peter was talking about this, like just the history of AI, like it's defined as either a research project or like some goal for some, like there's no such thing as AI. And if you keep it at that level of vagueness, it's really, really easy to live a life of like not being accountable to the particular thing. So, are we talking about large language models that are employed for, um, your schedule? Are you talking about large language models that are being used for spiritual guidance or for relationships? Those are all. So, I want to say we want to get really, really fine-grained on what we're talking about in specifics because there's a lot of things that we won't be able to have even a choice about in terms of AI. Although the workplace one is interesting because there's recently been moves to make religious exemptions for people using artificial intelligence, which is interesting because of the lack of legal precedent before, but stronger push now. But I would say fundamentally, we're not facing anything new. Formation has always been this issue about capturing a vision of God's kingdom and life in it, and the availability of God's kingdom to us right now. And I think Jesus did have a philosophy of technology. He talks about depersonalizing systems, and that I think is his way into the Sermon on the Mount. He's talking about these kinds of religious technologies. And his way of working that out is personal versus depersonalization. So I think that the AI question is a question about, so pick the relationship apps. Why is that there? Uh, I take it it's because there really is a problem and a lack of genuine relationship among people in all sorts of places in terms of socioeconomic. Um, uh, I mean, religious, non-religious, educated, non. There's all sorts of facts that might play into it, but across the board, there seems to be a very, very strong lack of relationality, of relationship among people. The AI problem with respect to the mental health issue, a big part of it is going to be able to offer something that's positive for people to experience and encounter, so that those things aren't as much of a temptation. And that's always been the sort of route of formation among the church, is that you want to have a positive engagement with Christ, and that to be the thing that centers and grounds you, not an aversion to things. Or the other way to put it would be Jesus was not against things as much as he was for things. And so, what are we for here versus what we're against? If we can get after that and make it palpable and available, rich, contextualized in people's place, that's where I think we can one do really well. We've got the resources for it too. But I just take it to be that that's the fundamental issue with the social aspect of AI.
Yeah. So there it seems like the relevant principles from Catholic social thought are kind of solidarity and human dignity. I just thought I'd share this observation. So the Harvard Business Review did a survey of the main uses of AI, 60,000 people or something like that. And it was just published earlier this month. The number one use case, therapy and companionship.
Yeah. And
Uh,
the year before that, it was in second place.
well, in their data, it was actually
Mm.
therapy and companionship was number one.
Oh, no,
Mm.
sorry, the first year. The
Yeah.
first year they did it.
So
Yeah.
number two was troubleshooting. So like my stereo is not working. But yeah, I mean, number seven, relationship advice. Number eight, work buddy. Number nine, astrology and tarot readings. So the relational is a very popular use case when it comes to AI. But anyway, so we're on the question of kind of practical advice about how we engage with AI in its various uses. I think Brandon's point here is very helpful. We need to sort of slice
Mm.
a little bit more finely than we tend to do when we just talk about AI writ large. But I'd love to hear our Peter and Elizabeth. Maybe Elizabeth, what's your take on like,
Yeah.
especially in your context in higher ed? What do you tell your students?
Well, this is one of the things we're thinking about a lot, which are practices that we can incorporate across campus to really help our students learn how to use AI well. I mean, we realize that they probably need to use it. And so that's part of our job. And they know that they need to use it. We've actually been doing focus groups around campus, talking to the students, and they are not wildly enthused about it. They're very anxious about the economic impact, but about the personal impact. All of them have stories of a friend who is kind of stuck in this sort of relational tie or engagement with AI, and it's really scaring them. So I think, and maybe one positive thing that's coming out of this is seeing these students who aren't just kind of swept away by this exciting new thing, even though in a sense it seems like it might make their lives easier. They're hesitant, they're concerned, they're asking us to come alongside them and provide guidance and support. So they see the need in a way that maybe some people our age even don't. So on the practical thing, I will say in the encyclical, my favorite part is the last third, the conclusion, which is where I think we really see Leo's pastoral heart coming out. And he is very clear that one of the ways we deal with this is to think that we can get overwhelmed. We can say, I can't make a change. I'm just one person. But then we, particularly as Christians, that as we think about how we're being formed, we can make choices. And in paragraph 232, I love what he highlights. He says, the dignity inscribed in each of us by the Holy Spirit can be seen in our capacity to reflect critically, choose and love freely, and form authentic relationships. So cultivate, I think it's really worthwhile thinking about, and to Peter's point about not kind of offloading our thinking, how are we developing in ourselves and for people like me in education or people in church leaderships and our students, these capacities for critical reflection, these capacities for free choice not meaning choose whatever you want, but the capacity to choose the good and to form authentic relationships. And to y'all's point, Alex, that survey you just cited, if we can help people learn to form authentic relationships, that cuts out the number one use case to AI. And I've got no issue with people using it to troubleshoot stereo repair.
So
Peter, I'll
Peter,
hand it off to you.
Peter, why don't you give your quick response to my kind of practical question, and then we've got some Q&A I'd like to get to in our last 11 or so, 10 minutes or so.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a question we're wrestling with in my profession as well. The fact is that these models are so good at producing software that you can just, in many, many cases, say, I have this vague problem. I would like you to solve it. And it will generate an enormous amount of code, and the problem will be solved. And you have engaged your brain at the absolute minimum level required to fuzzily define the problem that you're encountering. And so a better way maybe to use these models, and they are extraordinarily powerful. I mean, they are trained on the entire corpus of civilization's output to this point. And there's an enormous amount of software that they're trained on. So open source is a long tradition in computer science. There's lots and lots of software available for these things to ingest, and they can and do that. And so instead of treating it as a recipe book where it just generates exactly the steps you need to take to accomplish a very specific goal, I think learning to step back and frame your queries in a much more theoretical way. So this is something that I would like to accomplish, thinking about different approaches that you have personally, cogitated on and proposing those as alternatives, and then having the LLM use its vast training data to sort of give you the theoretical framework that you need to think inside in order to solve the problem yourself. That's the way that I'm currently using them today in my profession. I will say that, again, just back to Brandon's point, none of this is new. We have had for years access to all of all of the knowledge of civilization in our pockets, and we always end up watching short form video and doing things that are really lowest common denominator engagement of our intellect. So you can't just rely on individual grit and determination to use these tools the right way. There needs to be deep thinking about, at the design stage of these tools, about how to make them something that allows someone to enhance their God-given gifts, to engage their mind, and to help them move further than they otherwise could, instead of just turning off the mind and letting the LLM take the wheel. So, and the Pope had some great things to say about this when he talked about the formation of children, that we can't just leave the discipline to use these tools in a way that's beneficial to parents. We need to give them some help, and that means the political system needs to give them help. The companies that are designing these tools need to help them. The church needs to come alongside and give guidance as to how best to use these. So, yeah, I think that's where I land on that question.
The difficulty is we don't know though. So when we talk about like being responsible with our students, we don't really know exactly what that means because we don't know the effects yet. And some of the effects that we thought were going to happen actually were the reverse. And it's difficult and complex. I'll just say really quickly, I think AI is brilliant for a lot of things, especially I've got friends that have found um, uh, interventions for diseases that cancer that they had for years that doctors could not figure out and found one. It's brilliant. I've trained various ones to act. We're finishing up a book and I have it trained on my main interlocutor. I just have fun going back and forth with it. There's fun things too, but the dangers are we don't know what they are exactly.
So I want to take this opportunity. You'd mentioned, engaging with our students. We have a question here from one of our audience members. I work in K through 12 classical education, and I'm thinking deeply about how to approach the questions surrounding the use of specifically intelligent tutoring systems to supplement instruction. So like the alpha movement. So what frameworks of thought or resources would be most helpful to consider in this context or in pondering this particular issue? Do you guys have any suggestions?
I will put a plug in for some of the resources put out by Baylor School of Education, particularly the group focused on private Christian school. We have some amazing scholars who are looking at these questions pedagogically. So I think that Baylor School of Education would be, particularly from a Christian K through 12 education perspective. Some folks like John Eckert would be great to look into what the research they're doing specifically targeted on this. And one of the things I wonder, as someone who works with, college students, is it seems like there's a real difference between providing this for a third grader versus an eighth grader versus a senior in high school. And I think it would be we'd be foolish. I mean, to Brandon's point, we don't know exactly what this is, but we'd be foolish to treat all those developmental stages the same, just because they're all not in college yet.
Yeah, I will chime in here. My children attend a classical Christian school, and I've been involved as a volunteer educator there. I just cannot imagine substituting a human relationship for a simulacrum of one. I think children would be particularly vulnerable to the tendency to attribute personhood to a tool like this in a way that is deeply unsettling to me. I think a lot of the successes you have in the education of young children is really about their relationship with their teachers. They are interested in what their teacher sees as the proper way to form themselves to be better people. And if you are asking those questions of a computer, there's something, I think, sinister about that. So when the Pope says, in paragraph 239, let us cultivate relationships, the classical Christian school is a perfect place to cultivate those relationships. If you're a parent at one of these schools, volunteer to teach these children yourself. Don't delegate that to a machine. And Elisabeth, your point is well taken, that it's completely different in elementary versus